Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I particularly want to thank Shauna for inviting me and suggesting that this might be a good time to visit Toronto and see some very good rugs, and I'm thrilled that I've been able to do that. You've got a very, very nice exhibition to view in the other rooms if you haven't done so already, and it's a pleasure to be part of the festivities here. In 1983, John Thompson wrote a catalog called Carpet Magic to accompany an exhibition that was held at the Barbican Art Gallery in London. That book was reissued in a revised edition 5 years later with a different title, which confuses everyone. It's called Oriental Carpets from the Tents, Cottages, and Workshops of Asia. It's a terrific book, and it is the book I invariably recommend to interested beginners who want to look at carpets and learn something about them. It considers carpets from a slightly unusual standpoint, not the conventional one. It looks at them from the standpoint of the level of production, regardless of geography. And the discussion ends up, because of that, being much more consistent across the lines than it ever is when it's done on a geographic basis, because each of these cultures, and we're not talking about just one culture here, we're talking about many, each of these cultures has a wide range of different production levels, and they don't look much alike, and they don't necessarily go much together. So when you split it the other way, it looks quite different. It presents 4 categories of production found in many cultures across the rug weaving belt that extends from Morocco in the west to Central Asia or India in the east. These have been identified and acknowledged before. It's not a new concept. But that approach has never before been used as a basic framework for discussing the subject of carpet weaving as a whole. And this is, to my mind, a very significant contribution. The 4 levels of rug production are these, and these are given in order of increasing technical achievement, but no particular value judgment is intended in this at all. First, tribal weavings. These are weavings woven from memory. They're not designed per se. They're woven from memory by women. They're made primarily for use, including furnishing rugs, for floors, for doorways, storage and transport bags, animal trappings, prayer, tent bands, etc. They're not made primarily for sale. Sale is not their principal reason for manufacture, but extra pieces may occasionally be sold off to bring in a little extra income, but that's not the intent, that's not the purpose of it. These weavings reflect tribal traditions and lifestyle, whether the weavers are still on the move, that is still nomadic, or have settled. Some pattern elements have age-old meaning and are protective in nature or refer to tribal identity in some specific way. This large bag, a wall bag or juval, from the early 19th century is one of the great relatively early Turkmen weavings. It's an Arabachi bag at the Met, collection of James Ballard. Ghoul patterns, that is these medallion-like devices that are arranged in rows on the field, both primary and secondary, are very archaic in style. One is, the main one is the tauknoska with 4 pairs of animals, which are seen at the corners, if you will, at the points of the ghoul. Ghoul means flower in Turkish or Persian. Second, after tribal, is cottage industry. Cottage rugs are woven by women at home to augment family income. Sometimes they reflect the primitive aspects of tribal weaving, but they may also be highly inventive or experimental in an effort to appeal to fashion and saleability, which are concerns that the tribal weavers don't have. They can and often are influenced by the perceived wishes of customers. They're mostly woven from memory with the aid of a drawing or even with a cartoon, but without a precise or exact execution. This is a rug whose pattern identifies it as something called a lotto carpet. And it's a characteristic of quite a bit of cottage weaving, since they're made with the purpose of sale. Quite a few of these things were exported, even things from relatively humble or village circumstances. The lotto is a good case in point. These were made in the 16th and 17th centuries in various locales in Western Turkey. A lot of them ended up in Europe, and they're called a lotto design because during the course of the 16th century, they appeared in paintings by Lorenzo Lotto. He wasn't the first or the last to depict them, and so it's a slight misnomer, but that's the way it goes. But this pattern, which consists of staggered rows of octagonal medallions, which are a little hard to read, alternating with a cross-shaped device, almost like a tile pattern, is characteristic of the lotto. And it also reminds us how consistently this kind of patterning is favored by Turkish weavers, these staggered rows of devices of one sort or another, an infinitely repeating pattern. That's a very common Turkish arrangement. And here we have borders of nice cloud bands, which ultimately hark back to Chinese prototypes. So we have the lotto. This is a nice, probably early 17th century example in the Care collection, which some of you may know is going to be on loan to the Dallas Museum shortly. It may be there already for long-term viewing, I think 15 years. The same can be said of the rugs called Transylvanian rugs. These are rugs that were made in some of the same Turkish villages as part of cottage production. A lot of these rugs ended up in Transylvanian churches. They were gifts. They were exported to what is now Romania. They were acquired by local merchants, and they were donated to local churches. And that's where the best of these and the most of them have been preserved for us. Again, export products. And then a later example of cottage production would be an awful lot of the rugs produced in the Caucasus, typified here by this very splendid example of a Kazakh. There are three very nice Kazakhs in the exhibition to look at and admire as well. This is a late 19th century, and many of them are late 19th century, but deep pile and great colors. Third, after cottage industry, is town and city workshops. And the characteristics of this group is, one, they were made for commercial purposes. They were made for resale. Number two, they're products of workshops with specialized crafts, with the various aspects of rug production being divided among different craftsmen and artisans, each with his own skill to bring to bear on the production. The key thing about workshop production is that the rugs are designed. That distinguishes them from the tribal and also the majority of the village rugs. They're designed according to a cartoon that shows every knot and color for the specified pattern. And the drawing for this is prepared by a designer in many instances. The point is that with a cartoon, that has complete information in it, virtually any pattern can be woven. There's just no limit to this. On workshop carpets that were produced according to designs, one of the hallmarks in most of them is graceful and successful corner transitions in the borders. In rugs that have not been designed, that's usually the part of the rug execution that's the most awkward. It's usually not so graceful. It usually comes all the way down and then it starts over again to go across or something like that. This is a vase rug or vase technique rug. I happen to choose one that doesn't have a vase in it, but the name does come from those that have vases. It's a rug from Iran, 17th century. They were made in all likelihood in Kerman, and they were described by visitors to Iran at that time as being a very significant production, known in particular for great color. And this is an example in the Met from Joe McMullen's collection with a central medallion, which is slightly unusual, and then this nice array of flowering plants around the medallion, perhaps reflecting Indian influence at this moment, or perhaps not. Perhaps this is simply the Persian version of that same interest in flowers that crops up in the second quarter of the 17th century, partly as a result of the introduction of European herbals. So that's a 17th century example of workshop production. This is a 20th century example of essentially the same thing. This is a Qajar period and style rug, also produced according to a cartoon. And there's a subject here which is Alexander the Great and his struggle or combat with the devil. And this is a good example of, and there's also calligraphy in here which identifies the subject. And there are also a few aniline colors which don't need to concern us very much, but the color's a bit off. Okay, and then last, and this will be the main focus of what I'm going to talk about tonight, this court production. Now this is a very difficult slide to look at. It's a very difficult rug to photograph. It's never been photographed successfully. The pile is all silk, and there may have been a bit of color softening in this over the years, resulting in less contrast than we would like to distinguish pattern from ground. But it's an extraordinary example of court production from around 1535 or 1540 in Iran, most probably Kashan, which is one of the heartland cities near this Great Salt Desert. It's hard to see it from where you're sitting, but there is a central medallion. You could see some squiggles there because there are 4 pairs of dragons engaging with each other. There are corner medallions, each with a pair of dragons. I'll show that in just a minute. And then the field consists of a very, very complicated, elaborate array of 58 different figures, mostly horsemen, in motion. Some of those horsemen are engaged in combat with animals of one sort or another, lions or ibex or whatever, using knives or spears or swords. One sign of its complexity and its certain court production, because it's just too sophisticated to have been done in any other way and too costly a production, is it was made from a single cartoon of half the rug. And normally what you find with things like this is a cartoon that covers the part of the pattern that repeats, and that normally with a rug like this it would be 1/4 of the rug, which would then be flipped in both directions. So it would be repeated 3 times, yielding the 4 quarters. In this case, they did they did a cartoon of half the rug, particularly elaborate, and then just rotated it 180 degrees to do the other half. And even when they rotated it 180 degrees, in order to avoid the perception of repetition, they colored the figures in the other half differently from the figures in the first half. So it appears extremely varied and with no repeated passages at all. It's a huge rug. It's 7 meters long. It involves metal thread. It has very carefully drawn figures. Here's one of the corner medallions with a pair of the dragons. The border is very complex with figures seated, winged figures, savoring delicacies, I suppose, against a scrolling ground. So this is a representative of the sort of supreme imperial level that one will find. Now at this stage, 1535, 1540, there is no evidence that there were, in fact, royal workshops for carpets set up and working in Iran, even at the court or through an arrangement outside. There's no evidence of that at all. And yet, there's plenty of evidence that this is royal production, A, by virtue of its size, B, by virtue of the costly materials, and C, by connection to the court painting workshop, which I'll get to in a few minutes. Just the fact that there's a very close relationship between the patterns you see in this rug and the production of the court workshop for paintings at exactly the same moment strongly suggests a direct connection with the court workshop. Okay. The patterns of Oriental rugs originate mainly in the two poles of the four categories I mentioned. The court workshops on one hand and rustic production on the other hand, that being tribal or domestic. The influence of these patterns moves in both directions, that is top down and to a lesser extent, much lesser extent, bottom up. It must be said that the influence of court production is by far the stronger and more obvious of the two. I'm going to take a quick look at tribal production and their patterns, but then turn mainly to focus on the court material to consider its impact on the other levels of production. And I'll show, I'm not going to dwell on the workshop production or the cottage industry production, but I will show a number of examples of each in relationship to the other levels, just so you can get a sense of what happens as things move down. Within tribal, I'm going to focus on tribal weaving for just a minute here. The patterns found in tribal weavings reflect traditional motifs that have been woven from memory for generations, if not centuries. Their original forms are usually lost, and they have naturally evolved over time, thus making recognition sometimes quite difficult, recognition of what the original motif was. Some motifs seem to have specific meaning, which might be apotropaic or amuletic, or motifs are recognizable but do not necessarily have deep meaning for the weaving group, that is floral motifs, or motifs have no apparent or obvious meaning, but the manner of presentation, either form or color, allows us to associate them with a specific tribal entity. So even when you may have something familiar that you recognize as being a typical product of a tribal group, even though there's no particular meaning to be associated anymore, at least, with that motif. I want to consider three particular types of tribal weaving today rather quickly. One is Turkish kilims, second is South Persian tribal weaving, and the third is Turkmen rugs, all of which are represented in the exhibition. Turkish kilims are ostensibly among the most archaizing of all extant classes of weaving. Geometric elements, mysterious but suggestive in form, tantalize us with meaning, especially in the pieces that seem to have the greatest age. There's something primordial about these forms. This is a very archaizing white ground kilim whose main field pattern consists of 5 medallion-like forms, hexagonal in shape with projecting hooks, which belongs to a private collection in Munich. It has been carbon dated with a high level of probability, putting it between the 15th and 17th century. So that puts this in the rather rarefied company of very early kilims. A second kilim, which is much later, probably 19th century, has rows of forms that are more readily recognized, in this case as carnations, despite their angularity and geometric presentation. Woven silk or velvet panels bearing rows of curvilinear carnations, achievable because of the different weaving technique involved in those things, were popular in the 16th and 17th centuries and would seem to be the model for this kilim pattern. It has long been believed that kilims were part of a nomadic tent culture that was introduced to Anatolia between 1000 and 1450 or so by Turkic steppe nomads moving westward from Central Asia. In the 1980s, and culminating in a 4-volume study authored by an archaeologist and 2 kilim experts, a theory was promoted that challenged the prevailing notion about the origin of kilims and their introduction into Turkic culture, with the publication of Neolithic wall paintings from a site called Çatalhöyük, which dates to the 7th millennium BC. And that publication revealed patterns bearing uncanny similarities in the wall paintings to kilim patterns. The archaizing motifs seen especially in presumably older kilims were then linked in a huge rush of enthusiasm, because we all know that ruggies really want hard information. They really want to draw conclusions from things, to images of the mother goddess figure in various secondary forms in her pantheon. On the left here is a sketched reconstruction showing a deity holding 2 vultures. On the right is a kilim detail bearing a stylized representation that has been interpreted as a goddess holding 2 vultures. Many other comparisons, some awfully convincing based on visual evidence, were presented, and many rug people were indeed convinced. But it turned out that much of the evidence had been concocted, and the photographic or drawn evidence supporting the reconstructions was missing. Data was lacking or compromised. Field reports were missing or misrepresented. So, in the end, is it a carnation, or is it a goddess holding 2 vultures? We really can't say for sure. We can't dismiss the mother goddess theory altogether. There is too much acceptable evidence for that in the end, but we have to be very careful not to accept a whole new interpretation of kilim patterns and motifs based on doctored or even unproven drawings. The evidence needs to be solid. It also needs to be acknowledged that there is virtually no intermediate visual evidence to connect the ostensibly Neolithic paintings and the actual kilims. And that's 8,000 years apart. All right, a few observations about South Persian pieces. The weaving production of various South Persian tribal entities typically involved geometric grids or even medallions, especially in the bags and other small pieces. Most such elements seem ornamental in nature, although particular arrangements of colors can often be used to identify production. This charming small salt bag, it's either Luri or Bakhtiari, features a grid formed by columns of diamonds containing a knotted interlace. And there's a very nice small bag that relates to this in the exhibition, which is in the museum's collection. The main border here consists of a reciprocal angular scroll with projecting animal heads, hinting at the border's ultimately protective role in the design scheme. This very attractive bedding bag can be associated with the Kashkuli of the Kashgai, and it combines the urban influence demonstrated in the pile-woven sides, which show these rows, diagonal rows of botte or paisley-shaped elements, probably reflecting the influence of textiles, combining that with the flat-woven base, which conforms to more traditional tribal style. This is a very appealing 19th century piece. Not all tribal production reflects tribal tradition or style, and one could legitimately say, well, then is it tribal? This 19th century Kashgai copies an early 19th century Persian workshop carpet, and it's probably a high-grade example of village production. Another type of tribal production comes from the Fars district of South Persia, and these are called gabe, which is a Luri term. They're crudely woven but very appealing rugs made for use. They typically have patterns consisting only of areas of color, normally organized in geometric patterns of one sort or another. Very, very broad brush, though, broad stroke. This one is a little unusual with these very stylized animals. And the third group I want to mention quickly is the Turkmen group. And these are, to my mind, the classical rugs of the tribal world. At their best, they're powerful and refined and beautifully made, and they speak in tones from the distant past. This is a techie main rug of a type very similar to the Haley collection piece in the exhibition. And you can see that, like the Arabachi bag we looked at a few minutes ago, it consists of an arrangement of two different goal patterns, a primary and a secondary. The goals are, theoretically at least, marks identifying tribal origin, but that cannot be taken on its own, because here we have the same goals seen in the Arabachi bag. So one has to look at other things too, including weave and color and the finish of the edges and things like that, in order to make a real determination. Many of the panels we see were the decorated fronts of bags that were used to transport or store bedding and clothing. But there were also important decorations for the tribal camel, woven as part of a bride's trousseau. These were usually large pieces. This one, for example, is 67 inches wide, and sometimes featured touches of silk in the pile, as this one does. The pattern, nevertheless, depends upon the gul type identified with the tribe, as it was the case with the larger pieces as well. And then we also have other types of utilitarian weavings, such as this Yamud horse cover, which is very similar to one in the exhibition. There are no gules here at all. These are simple stripes with geometric patterns running in them, which are probably related to the patterns of flat woven covers made to some degree by the same people. All right, that was just a little sort of review of the patterns one sees in a range of tribal weavings. And we're going to flip now to the sort of the other end of the spectrum and take a look at what happens in court production. And one of the things that was slightly interesting to me in John Thompson's discussion was how little attention it paid to court production, even though he acknowledged that an awful lot of what we see in the other three levels originates there. And I think it was partly because he was trying to do this on the other types because they're just perhaps less well known. But it's an important part of the discussion, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that. One of the things that is important about court production is that it involves workshop. In fact, when you talk about court production, you're really talking about the same thing as commercial production, except at a slightly more rarefied level with more expensive materials. But the process is about the same. You have specialists doing different things. These rugs are designed rugs. They sometimes involve a trained artist who is the designer of things. They often do. And that's certainly what one sees with court production. I'm going to focus here on things from either Iran or India or Turkey because those are the sort of the main court centers. But part of what I'm talking about would apply also to Mamluk Egypt around 1500 or during the 16th century. And there's one excellent carpet on loan from the Art Gallery of Ontario in the show, which represents that production. The rug I'm showing here is a Persian carpet from around 1600. It belongs to a class known as the Sangushko group because of perhaps the most important example of this type, which once belonged to a prince of that name. That's given the name to the group. And some of these rugs are distinctively pictorial in nature. And there are different levels of pictorial subject matter. Oftentimes, and I'll show a few examples of this, they're very generic in nature and they consist of hunting scenes or animals scampering through a landscape or something like that. So they're figural, but they're still generic. This is an example where actual stories are being illustrated, and they're precisely the kinds of stories that are illustrated in books. Here is a scene. It's a passage from a very famous work of literature from Iran, and it's the story of Khosrow and Shirin, Persian lovers, typically unrequited. The love is unrequited, as it almost always is in Iran. Here we see Khosrow in Iranian literature. Excuse me. Khosrow, the prince, rides his horse in the upper right. He's got a finger to his mouth, which means I have an emotion. We can guess what that emotion might be. Beautiful horse with a raised foreleg. And he's watching the Armenian princess Shirin bathing in the pool below. And the story, just very quickly, is that Khosrow becomes infatuated with the idea of Shirin, who was described to him by one of his princely buddies, and he becomes infatuated with this. And the buddy takes off, goes to Armenia, shows Shirin a picture of Khosrow, and she becomes infatuated too. Okay, they're both infatuated and they want to meet. And without talking to each other, each one sets off for the other one's country. They happen to meet at the midpoint, and this is where Khosrow sees Shirin, and they're basically speechless with emotion and stop and gaze at each other and keep going. So it doesn't work. Anyway, that's the story. Let me go back here for a second. Now, if you look, I don't think I have a pointer here, but I don't really need one. If you look in here, here you I can't quite see it. Here and here, you have, is that it? quite tell. I think so. I think that's the pool. Oh, here's the pool. Here's Shireen in the pool there. Here's Khosrow watching her. Repeated over there. This may or may not be the same thing repeated. I can't quite tell. But anyway, this is the passage right from that story, and it's combined with a passage from another story. In the dead center, you see a camel with a howdah on the top, and that holds a figure of Majnun, who is the female in another story of unrequited love, Layla and Majnun, other star-crossed lovers. So this is extracting bits from very, very well-known examples of literature. In the border, there are just more conventional single elements of generic things. Okay, so that's a connection to court production and court imagery, and I'll show you another one. This is a wonderful Indian carpet in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and this also extracts passages and combines them in unusual ways. These are not specifically identifiable, these are more generic. There's a passage at the top which is sort of a palace scene, a palace set in a landscape. Below that is for the sort of the top, what would it be, the third quarter of the rug shows a hunting scene in a landscape which involves a bullock drawing a cart that has a hunting cheetah tethered to the back, which is a scene right out of, the history of Akbar in the late 16th century in India, and this rug dates about 10 years later. And then you've got this passage at the bottom with a fantastic elephant-headed lion clutching 7 little elephants in a rather mysterious way. This is a mythological combination which appears both in a couple of drawings and also in some inlaid woodwork. So it's part of the decorative arts repertoire of this moment. And they kind of arbitrarily just selected these passages and put them together to represent that moment in time. This is a rug from around 1600. This is one of the figures from that big Kashan hunting carpet in Vienna. I just wanted to show you the style of a horseman who is galloping along here and swinging with his left hand, swinging a sword at an animal, must be an antelope of some sort. It's smallish. I can't quite make it up because of damage. But this, I'm showing you this to give you a sense of the style of that rug and just how close it is to the style of the paintings of the same moment. This is virtually the same year, 1535 or so. This is a wonderful painting done for a great manuscript in the British Library. It was done between 1539 and 1543 by the leading painter at the court, a painter named Sultan Muhammad. And the parallel is so close in style between the horse that one great scholar has actually identified the designer of the figures in that rug as Sultan Muhammad himself. Now, there's a group of velvet panels, mostly with lobes like this, which contain a variety of scenes, some of them hunting scenes. There's also a few with Layla and Majnun shown, and other things. It's tempting to think about these velvets as perhaps part of the suite of furnishings that included the silk hunting carpet from Vienna and or a similar but smaller rug at the Boston Museum. But in fact, it's not likely that they were ever put together. They could be together, they could have been in a sense, because some of the figures that are visible in either of those two rugs, the same figures appear in the velvets. And I'm alluding particularly to this horseman at the upper right who is grappling with the lion right here and is stabbing the lion in the neck with a knife. That same figure in exactly the same pose appears in the two silk hunting carpets. And what that means is Apart from the question of cartoon and design, which almost certainly came from the royal workshop, the painting workshop, maybe by Sultan Muhammad himself. Apart from that, there must have been pattern books with these stock figures available to the artists to draw from in putting their compositions together, because this such figure repeats, and it's repeating in carpets and also in velvets. There are also patterns involving animals with flowering plants in the background, and there's a direct connection between carpet design at this time and also manuscript production in terms of illumination, the illumination of margins, the illumination of frontispieces, and so forth. And I'll show you one example. This happens to be an Indian example from the middle of the 17th century, somewhat later than this Persian rug, but it doesn't matter because the Indian version here is actually, it reflects ultimately Persian style and taste. And here you see animal combats of several sorts, and lions and deer or stags gamboling through the landscape. This is another great Indian rug that belonged to the Duke of Ilchester at one time. It's in England. Very Indian coloring you can see here. Again, one difference here is that instead of animals in a landscape or with flowers, this one, in this case, the animals are set against a ground of scrolling vines. This is a classic illumination type. This rug is from around 1610 to 1620. I'm sorry this is black and white, but it's the only way it can be viewed. This is a page from an album made for the Emperor Jahangir. This page dates from 1611-12, and so it's virtually contemporary with that rug. And you see in the margin a whole constellation of vines, flowers, scrolls, complicated palmettes, with animals interspersed and leaping across those vines, just in the same style as the rug. There's a connection between what's being produced in the book atelier, particularly for royal consumption, and what's being produced with the top level of carpets. This is an example of scrolling vine and blossom design with no animals or anything else. And this, to my mind, is one of the most beautiful carpets in the world. This is a piece from the Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon. This is a detail of the half of the rug that they own. What they have is a piece 18 feet long and 4.5 feet wide. That's half the original rug. But this is made with a pashmina pile, and it has about 1,000 knots to the inch. And it is simply breathtakingly beautiful. It's also quite similar to what was going on, not just in the book workshop, but in painting in buildings. This is a painted panel in the tomb of Akbar at Sikandra. This was done in 1613, and it has the same complicated blossoms and leaf patterns, these sort of segmented leaves, and look at the very complicated blossom in the center of the composition, very reminiscent of some of the things going on in the Gulbenkian rug. And the other thing is that the Gulbenkian rug has a red ground, but it does have this gold border, which reminds us of a gold ground, such as the one seen here in the painted version. Let me talk for a minute about designs that have a central focus, because this is a major contribution of the court taste and design on rugs, and it's an influence that was passed down and appears in every level of production. It appears in manuscripts in particular. We see it in bindings, as in the case here in this 15th century binding, with a lobed medallion in the center, quarter medallions in the corners. One sees it also in illuminated rosettes or shamsa, which typically introduce books in the Islamic world. Notice in this roundel, this illuminated roundel, there are these little lobed areas around the edges, and that suggests the strong influence that came from China in developing this whole idea of a central medallion around which the rest of the design would be organized. This is a beautiful carpet with a big central medallion. This is obviously not the complete thing, but it shows you enough so that you can see what's going on. But look at the way the edges of that medallion fold into the interior of the medallion. That whole arrangement is very reminiscent of the kinds of designs that were being promoted by the Chinese designers, particularly with costume. The collar patterns on Chinese costume involved collars that worked exactly this way. And Chinese textiles came to the Middle East, and drawings and sketches came to the Middle East, including some sketches in an album in Berlin and Istanbul, sketches of these cloud collar designs. So they were in the Middle East and available to be used. And I think at the Persian workshops in particular, these were seized upon. There's a very nice small or fragment from a slightly later rug of this type, Northwest Persian type, in the exhibition lent by the Wolves, which is very, very handsome. Okay, other medallion designs, just to give you some examples. This is an Ottoman piece, early 17th century, centralized design, again with corner pieces, one of several fragments from this. This is an Indian example dating from around 1625 or 30. This has ended up in Japan. There was a time when the various block associations, if you want to call them that, in Kyoto were actively collecting particularly foreign textiles and rugs as status symbols, and some very, very good pieces, Persian and Indian, made their way to Japan. This is one that appears every year on one particular association's float as it's hauled through the city. Quite amazing. And I wanted to show you a very late version. Medallion designs, of course, are very, very prevalent, particularly in Persian carpets, but also in some Indian and Turkish too. It all harks back to the court design in the 15th, but particularly 16th centuries, resulting from the book designers and the probable Chinese influence on them at that time. This is a rug from the 70s from Esfahan. Let me show you a series of prayer rugs, because this demonstrates better than anything else I can think of the change that occurs as these things are passed from one layer to another. You all know what prayer rugs are. You know, they're portable versions of the architectural niche in a mosque or other building that indicates the direction of Mecca for prayer. And a prayer rug allows the devout to simply place the rug where he or she is and pray towards Mecca. I'm going to show you a couple of late examples first. They're very good, but they're late, just to remind you what they look like. This is a gyurdis, probably early 19th century, something like that, maybe late 18th. It's a high-grade one. Rugs like this were extremely popular 60, 70 years ago and were collected in vast quantity by people like James Ballard and some European collectors. This one is from St. Louis, in fact, where part of Ballard's collection went. Notice the decorative elements that flank the two sides of the field of the niche. Notice the device, the floral device that sits in the middle of the niche against the white ground, unattached to anything else. We'll see hints of this again. It's the arch form at the top of the field that tells us this was meant to be a prayer rug. That's the architectural niche. Here's another example. This is a flat weave. It's a kilim from Senna. Very beautiful example. This was Joe McMullen's. It's now at the Met. 19th century. Here, the only thing that tells us about the function of the rug is the niche itself. There's nothing else to indicate this. Here is an example, slightly atypical example, of the mihrab in a mosque. This is the mihrab in the Great Mosque in Cordoba in southern Spain. This was built over the course of 4 different campaigns between the 8th and the late 10th centuries. This portion of it is 10th century, and unlike the typical mihrab in a mosque or other building, this one is actually a room behind the wall, the directional wall. Usually these things aren't separate rooms. They're just flat, and there's a niche in the wall that indicates the direction. For reasons that aren't quite clear, in Ottoman Turkey in the late 16th century, they designed and made very, very costly and beautiful prayer rugs whose connection to an architectural prototype or model was absolutely clear and unmistakable. If you look at this rug, which is in Kuwait, in the Al-Sabah collection, there are 2 engaged columns here with very detailed and accurate representations of capitals and bases. The lamp in the niche is clearly a lamp, and it is connected, it hangs in the niche, as you would see in many mihrabs in use. So you have this clear architectural type. This dates from around the 1580s or something like that. Another example, even more famous, is the Ballard rug at the Met, which has a triple niche configuration with multiple columns that are engaged and are clearly meant to be columns. This is a 17th or 18th century example whose design connection to at least this type and this particular pattern is clear. It has the same niches. You can see that the columns are getting a little simpler in their execution. They're not as detailed, especially at the base where you've got very architectural forms, almost a kind of faceting. You see that in the capitals as well. That's all gone. It's a simplified, somewhat stylized version. This is a village version, a cottage version of the court pieces we just saw. 17th, 18th century Anatolian. Here's another one. And this is one where that form is no longer directional, but has been flipped in mirror image about the central axis, central horizontal axis. And it also contains in multiple places a date which is equivalent to 1768. So we're moving through time here from about the 1580s to 1768. This is another very nice example of village production. And then there's this one. The niche has disappeared completely. The only thing left is the 2 pairs of columns from the center of the rug. But it harks back to the same thing. It's become very stylized, and it doesn't mean very much anymore, but the model for this still is the same. And then the last one I want to show you is this, because although this is to all intents and purposes a medallion design, it has a central element, which is the focus here. There is some thought that the medallion type actually comes from a prayer design with a niche, which is then doubled around the central axis. And there are versions of these that have elements at the base of the field which could also be doubled to form the medallion. I personally think that what happened, though, was that the medallion design came in on its own as a result of Chinese influence and book production, but someone realized the connection, the relationship in shape to one end of the field, and they actually incorporated a very stylized version of a mosque lamp here in making that connection. But I don't think that's the actual source. Okay, now the last thing I wanted to show you is the influence of textiles. A few examples of this. And again, this is mainly in court production, but it trickles down. This is a splendid rug of a type known as a polonaise. Polonaise rugs were first identified at the World's Exposition in Paris in 1878 through a series of fairly finely woven silk and metal thread rugs that belong to a Polish collection. And it was thought at that moment that they were actually Polish production, and so they were called polonaise. But it was learned not too much later that they weren't Polish at all. They were actually Persian, but the name has stuck ever since, so they're still called polonaise. But look at the pattern of this in the field. It's actually a rather small pattern unit that repeats again and again and again vertically and horizontally. I'm showing this sideways, but it doesn't matter. And that's an approach to design that is common in textiles, where it actually means something as a, let's call it a labor-saving or time-saving device. Once the loom is set up to weave a particular pattern, even a small unit, it can then be repeated again and again and again. Well, repeating a pattern in a knotted carpet doesn't save you any time at all, because each time you do it, it's the same amount of work. So there's not really any point in doing one of these woven textile patterns unless that's the look you want to end up with, and that must have been the case here. There must have been some status element involved, or it was just pleasing to have this kind of repeat. This is a rug that dates from about 1660. It's in Copenhagen, and it's a complicated story of how it got there, but it was basically a gift from the Dutch, who had gotten it in Asia, to the Queen of Denmark in 1666, and it's been there ever since, and it's in perfect condition. It's amazing. That's a textile design on a carpet, for reasons we don't quite understand. Another great example of textile patterning can be seen here in a large fragment in the Victoria and Albert Museum, which involves multiple grids or lattices which overlay each other. This is actually 3 different grids. I'm not going to be able to point it out too clearly, but you've got one grid whose network vine, and it goes back and forth, is green with gold edges here. You have another one here, and then there's a third one that's white. 3 separate grids. Each one has a lattice pattern that is in and out and forming sort of lozenges, each with its own palmettes and blossoms and leaves attached at particular places. Now here's a vase carpet that has a vase in it. So you know I'm telling you the truth this time. But this is another floral origin, possibly related to textiles. This is a dragon carpet from the Caucasus, late 17th, early 18th century, from Vienna. In the spaces within this lattice network, the lattice being the sort of diagonal lines that form the framework for the pattern, there are these animals, dragons, some engaged in combat with phoenixes, giving the name to the rug, and it's thought that these rugs are cottage versions of carpets that were designed either at the court or on a commercial level and then produced in the Caucasus in a slightly rougher way. They're extremely appealing and attractive and powerful, but they reflect a different level of production that doesn't survive. We don't have any examples of the court or commercial version of this. This is a nice kazak, and I show it to you because the elements of the pattern here in these diamonds is actually something that's borrowed from textile tradition and just incorporated in the rug design as kind of an inventive change from the norm, because this represents tie-dyeing in textiles as translated into carpet weaving. This is a Seljuk carpet that was found in the early 20th century in a mosque in Turkey. It's now in Istanbul. And these are considered to be 14th century. There are a couple of others of the same group. And they've been called by many people over the years Seljuk court pieces. But in fact, they're not very finely woven, and they're more likely to represent some sort of cottage production at that time. It has an interesting pattern. You see this sort of a diamond or hexagonal shaped element that's repeated in rows that has projecting hooks, a blue center, and a kind of stem that extends off to the side and below. So, Turkey, 14th century, an unusual design that we don't immediately recognize, that's a little bit hard to figure out. And what do we see but another version of it? This one is Spanish, second half of the 15th century. Somehow, Spanish rug weavers, and there was a lot going on in Spain at this time with carpet weaving, big rugs in several different centers. Somehow, they got a hold of either a rug of this type or something else and wove the same pattern. And then there's this, and this is the source. This is a Chinese silk from the Yuan dynasty, 13th or early 14th century, with a cloud band pattern, or cloud pattern. Look at the stem extending off to the lower zone and to the right. And what we can't quite figure out in the other two rugs, in the center, is actually a funny version of what's going on here, which is almost character-like in its representation. It's interesting that this particular textile, this fragment itself, which is in the Met, was actually excavated in Egypt. So we know that this textile was, and textile type, was traded and ended up in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that would explain the connection with Turkish production. The Spanish rug is even later. That's the latest of the three. How one can explain that, I don't quite know, but maybe someone will figure that out. But they're all connected, and it's all a textile pattern. And then the last one, and I'm going to close with this, is a 17th century Turkish piece, cottage production. And this, again here, like the coronation rug I showed you from Copenhagen, has a repeat pattern. Here we've got these diamond-shaped units in the field with floral elements inside and several serrated leaves around the edges. This is, again, not a natural carpet pattern at all. This is a pattern that reflects the designs of contemporary velvets or brocades that somehow reached the cottage level of weaving, where they produced something that reflected, didn't necessarily imitate, didn't necessarily mimic, but reflected what was perceived as the court style at that moment. Thank you very much.